Thank you so much for being here on such a beautiful fall day. It's very crisp out, but it's really beautiful. So thank you for being in here. It's the cozier room, I'm told, so we did get the better room apparently, but thank you for being here. Yes, kinesiology is a very big program. I have one class of 940 students that is separated into two classes of 500, which I find much easier to lecture to than this size. I find this size actually more nerve-wracking, so I'm sorry if my nerves get the better of me in the beginning, but hopefully I'll start to relax. I'm told that you're a very warm and welcoming crowd, so I'm just going to go with that. I'm going to start with a confession, another confession, I guess, my second confession already. I am an absolute sucker for the drama of sport. Pardon me, I'm just going to set my timer so I can keep track of time. I'm a sucker for the drama of sport. When I see a team or an athlete win a medal, when I see them celebrating after a goal or a win, when I see athletes, standing on the podium and their national anthem is playing and there's tears streaming down their cheeks, I am crying right along with them. I really do. I am a marketer's dream. I'm an ideal audience for these, for marketers, because I get completely caught up in the drama of how sport brings us together, and how, in seeing an athlete or a team struggle against adversity, training so hard with lack of funds, with lack of support, and yet still managing to get to the Olympics or get to some other world-class level, athletic event, and to see them win or to see them achieve their goals, I get caught up in that narrative, and I feel like we are all standing behind that team, standing behind that athlete, and then we are thus united together. But through my graduate work, I have been trained. I've been trained to look critically at sport, to look critically at the norms that are reproduced in sport and the assumptions that we make about sport. So it's my intention in this talk to really closely examine one of these assumptions, the idea that sport unites us, or that sport participation can foster a sense of belonging. But I really felt I had to begin with my confession because I wanted to acknowledge, just from the outset, how compelling it can be to see the drama of sport unfold, to be captivated by the excitement of a match, and to see that others feel it too, and to take pleasure in knowing that we now share a common bond because we have supported this athlete or watched this particular event, that we share a common bond with maybe colleagues, neighbors, or, dare I say, fellow Canadians. So the main question that I wish to engage with in this talk is, does sport divide us, or does it unite us? And to answer this question, I'm going to be drawing on some work that I completed with Dr. Peter Donnelly at the University of Toronto and some work that I've done here at York as well. So sport is frequently believed to be a vehicle for promoting belonging because it's, quote unquote, a universal language. We assume, we don't need to speak the same language, but if we all know how to play soccer, or if we know how to play basketball or some other global sport, then it doesn't matter. Then we can transcend those differences, that we can connect over the love of a game, the pleasure of scoring a goal together, or even the commonality of admiration for skill or admiration for athletic ability. In the research, though, there's actually very limited understanding of how, the actual mechanics of how a sense of belonging is fostered through sport. We can speculate that it might be an indirect effect of the various benefits of sport participation. So we know, the research tells us that through sport participation, we can improve our physical fitness, we can improve our mental health, we can improve our self-confidence, self-esteem, self-efficacy, or the belief that we can achieve something. If it's a team sport, it can often improve our social skills, teamwork, empathy, cooperation. These are established findings in the research. And those particular benefits might be able to, we could speculate, we could make the case that those specific evidence-based benefits of sport could lead to an enhanced sense of belonging. Improved mental health, for instance, could promote a sense of well-being, and then coupled with improved self-esteem and self-confidence could then lead to greater empathy or cooperation. Perhaps that could lead to a greater sense of community or a greater sense of cohesion. Another possibility is that if your self-esteem is raised, it could enhance your confidence in being able to participate in wider social groups, or to engage in dialogue with people who are different from you, different contexts, different positionalities, or even different cultural backgrounds. So in other words, we can only really speculate as to how sport actually promotes social inclusion. Indeed, what we do know for certain is that sport actually functions as a system of exclusion. Each of us may be able to relate to not being able to play or participate because of a lack of skill. But even beyond the lack of ability, the inability to play a sport, with increasing levels of competition, the ability to play sport really depends on the athlete and his or her family's material ability to access the sport system. Some of you may know that hockey costs a great deal. Just the equipment alone, $740. Compare that to something like soccer, $160. So we know that hockey costs a great deal in terms of the equipment. But driving to practice, driving to tournaments, that requires time. Training camps in the US, being able to access those. Maybe even moving neighborhoods, changing schools, moving cities to get to good coaching, to be seen by a recruiter, to be noticed by a recruiter. These strategies, which are increasingly being seen as ways to access higher levels of sport, are actually only options that are possible for a very limited few. Sport may also be socially exclusive and divisive, not just along lines of social class, but also with regards to race, gender, ability, sexuality, and so on. There have been incidences in professional hockey as well as soccer where fans have thrown bananas onto the ice or the field, specifically targeting Black or African players. You may be familiar with the story of PK Subban, who was targeted by racist tweets. This was only just 2 years ago. You may know the story of Dutee Chand, who is a sprinter from India, who was subjected to gender verification testing in order to compete, and that even at one point was prevented from competing as a woman. Women athletes continue to receive less media coverage, and generally speaking, have less lucrative sponsorships than their male counterparts. Some specific sports like tennis or golf are starting to reach parity, but generally speaking, they receive less lucrative sponsorships than their male counterparts. So sport can be socially exclusive and divisive. But if we still believe that sport can unite us, then which sport are we talking about? Hockey is frequently identified Hockey is frequently identified as Canada's sport. Even a study that was done on the meaning of sport among newcomers to Canada, this was a study done just 2 years ago, those newcomers, those new Canadians identified hockey as Canada's sport. And that to become Canadian, it was very important, these newcomers said, to at the very least know about hockey in order to participate in the small talk, in the minutia, right, of interaction. The small talk with coworkers around, while during coffee breaks or around the water cooler. The small talk with neighbors, the parents of your children, or the parents of children that your own children play with. As this quote said, you had to learn enough to pretend like you know what you talk about, like you know what you're talking about, to be able to perform that Canadian identity. Knowing how to talk about hockey became one of those skills. And yet, with the exception of girls and women's hockey, participation in hockey in general has plateaued. Fewer and fewer people are actually playing hockey in Canada. Soccer is the fastest growing sport at the moment. So is hockey Canada's sport? Maybe not. Perhaps it's because it's financially inaccessible to many people, or perhaps it's because of the culture of aggression, physical dominance, and violence that hockey is associated with. There's risks of concussion that are being highlighted in the media with regards to sport, with regards to hockey. So hockey is increasingly being seen in a poorer light. This same study, where these newcomers said, you need to know about hockey to make it in Canada, also said, those elements of the culture of hockey, the physical aggression, the hitting, the violence, that's a barrier to participation. That was something that they rejected. And they didn't want to participate in sport, even in that sport, or their children to participate in that sport, even if they were willing to perform the identity of hockey being their sport. It may just be too much. It just may be too much to expect sport, which is a system of exclusion, to also serve as a tool for social unity. Having said that, though, we also know that sport can be a very powerful vehicle for social change. All of these athletes whose images you see here have at one time or another used the platform, literally in the case of John Carlos and Tommy Smith and John Carlos, featured here, literally the medal platform, or simply the platform of being a successful athlete. They've used that platform to speak out against injustice. It may be that sport can lead to greater social cohesion and unity, even if we don't really know how it happens, and even if there's evidence that sport divides us, categorizes us, allocates us into hierarchies. So I'm going to go back to this question of whether sport divides or unites us, and I'm going to give the very dissatisfying answer of maybe. What is perhaps easier to answer is whether sport can help to promote multiculturalism. And I'm going to talk about multiculturalism as it is defined in the Canadian legal framework. So the Multiculturalism Act has three fundamental ideas: that all citizens are equal, that all citizens can keep their identities, and that they're free to preserve, practice, enhance, and share their culture, their cultural heritage, and as a result have a sense of belonging. And the third fundamental idea of the Multiculturalism Act in Canada is the promotion of full and equitable participation in all aspects of Canadian society. So based on this very specific element, I suppose, of social inclusion or being socially united, and so I'm focusing very specifically on multiculturalism. Based on this, we can identify ways in which sport can actually align with these kind of fundamental ideas of multiculturalism, particularly the second and third principle. So sport can promote multiculturalism because, frankly, a diverse group of people can play. When you think of an image of multiculturalism, you might, in fact, you could even take a picture of this room, of this audience. Just simply the visible diversity, physical diversity, and that being represented on a team or in a tournament. Someone could say, look, evidence that sport and multiculturalism are linked together. And sport can provide a way to preserve and enhance and take pride in their own cultural heritage and have a sense of belonging as well. I'd like to share with you a website that was just recently launched called GTA Activity. I'm one of the co-investigators for this particular project. So GTA Activity is a public archive. So I welcome you to and invite you to add your own activities on this website as well. The intention behind this project is to try to capture the diversity of physical, cultural forms that people engage in the Greater Toronto Area. So let me show you some of the recent posts. Actually, I'd rather go this way. So there's categories of sport, physical games, dance, exercise systems, martial arts. And at the moment, just with sport alone, there are 144 activities listed. I'll just click on pickleball. Has anyone heard of pickleball? No. Oh, I see a couple of nods. So this allows you to explore what it is. It's a racket sport that combines aspects of tennis, badminton, and table tennis. And it has a bit of the rules. You can also see where you can give it a try. There's a location list here and where you can try it out. And if you have any other additional information, you are invited to add additions as well. I'll just show you a couple more. Some of you may not agree necessarily with the categorization of, for instance, CrossFit as a sport. But as an aside, the definition of sport is actually quite narrow anyway. Ultimate Frisbee is here, which used to be a physical game but has now increasingly become much more institutionalized and is more considered a sport. I'm trying to see if there's any that are unexpected. This is kabaddi, which is sort of similar to wrestling, but much more. Anyway, I shouldn't speak for it. It's a contact sport, essentially, but it's a team sport as well. And again, you can see where you can try these activities out. The intention is to capture the diversity of activities. And so, something like this illustrates the second principle of multiculturalism because you can see the diversity of physical cultural forms that people are trying to preserve and maintain. The third way in which sport can align with the fundamental ideas of multiculturalism is people who are of different cultural backgrounds can then support the same team. So you may recall when the Pan Ams were being held in Toronto, there was an idea, a narrative around the Pan Am Games that it would unite the various communities in Toronto, the multicultural and diverse communities in Toronto, and it would unite us behind the Canadian athletes that were playing that were competing in the Pan Ams in Toronto. Another example is highlighted here in the quote from, again, the Institute for Canadian Citizenship report that looked at newcomers in sport. This idea that, you feel Canadian through supporting and celebrating the feats of a Canadian Olympic team member, celebrating their medals. Now, a common idea across these relationships between sport and multiculturalism is the notion of intermixing, intermingling, interacting. In fact, to qualify for the Interaction Fund, which is administered by the Canadian Citizenship and Immigration in their multiculturalism program, the activity or the event has to include more than one ethnic group. The emphasis is on intermixing, integrating. Specifically, this funding program says that the activity or the event has to demonstrate that more than one single cultural, religious, or ethnic community is involved, and that there are established concrete opportunities for them to interact with one another. But this is actually a relatively recent change. Before, these funds were provided for ethnic communities to just support their own cultural endeavors. There was no requirement around interaction and integration. Funds are now only provided to projects intended to bring ethnic groups, cultural groups, and mainstream communities together. And I say this change is recent because it is based on ideological beliefs that have gained a stronger foothold within a post-9/11 context. In such a context, there is a growing belief that multiculturalism and the fact that it encourages people to maintain connections with their traditions or maintain connections with their cultural or ethnic communities, that this can actually lead to fragmentation, that it can lead to ghettoizing of communities and societies. But the research, with regards to sport anyway, the research indicates that supporting ethnic and cultural community sport activities does not have a fragmenting or ghettoizing effect. In fact, we see the opposite. So this is based on a study that looks at the lifespan of sport activities. And the research seems to indicate that there are three specific trajectories. I know I've added a fourth here, but I'll mention that in a little bit. That there are at least three clear, not necessarily mutually exclusive because some activities shift between trajectories, but there are three trajectories for sports introduced to Canada by immigrant communities. And some of you might be able to relate or see parallels between your own experiences and those of your family members as I go to describe some of these trajectories. The first trajectory is that the activity initially involves just the first generation members and it's an exclusive participation. And subsequently, there's a decline or a virtual disappearance of the sport in the second generation. Some of the activities and examples include korfball, which is a Dutch game. I'm probably going to mispronounce this. Pesäpallo, which is a form, it's similar to baseball. It's a Finnish game. And another example is Eisstock, which is pictured here in the image. But again, as I already said, these are not mutually exclusive categories, and this was based in a GTA sample. In Kingston, you will find Eisstock. You might not be able to find it in the GTA, but you'll find it in Kingston. So again, the lifespan and the trajectories in which we have allocated these sports is quite dynamic. Now, for various reasons, maybe it's a lack of physical space, lack of physical infrastructure, the sports just simply become, is no longer a regular part of the physical cultural forms that people are participating in. Maybe it's not meaningful for the second generation or just not of interest. Some activities do survive or they're played informally, maybe at family gatherings or with community celebrations. The second trajectory is where we see exclusive participation by the first generation, then you see increasingly more inclusive participation, expansion to other communities. And examples can include different martial arts systems, pictured here, Chinese 9-man volleyball, but I'll actually say more about this a little bit later. And these activities might be sought out by other individuals and communities because they're seen as novel, they want to give it a try, or the original participants expand and reach out to other communities because they want to increase the quality of the team. Maybe they see a ringer that they can use on their team to win a tournament, or maybe it's for commercial purposes. They open a dojo, they open a martial arts school, they want to attract more new students. It might be a way to declare your presence, your desire to share your cultural forms, or it's to ensure that your activity survives. So for instance, these particular activities, which may not necessarily have been explicitly saying we're not going to include people who aren't of our community, it simply was just a practice that was engaged within the community. When people realized we don't have enough to field a team or we don't have enough to even have a game, it might have been an active, let's teach other people about this activity to ensure that it survives. Some of these activities and teams might have maintained the very specific ethnic name to their tournaments or clubs or leagues, but the actual participants might have different ethnic backgrounds. The third trajectory is that it was always inclusive, right from the outset, and continues to be. So Aussie rules football, kabaddi, and various martial arts are examples of this third trajectory. Aussie rules football is quite interesting because while they do specify that there has to be Australian players on the team, it is very small. I believe it's only 4 players. A maximum of 4 players can be Australian, and the rest must be Canadian. It's specified in their rules. And now the reasons for this could be simply they couldn't field a team otherwise. And so it was just all right from the outset, we want to play this game, but we need, a team of 10, and there's only 3 of us. We better find some other people to play with. Or it might be, we're in Canada now, this multiculturalism is really important to us. Let's embrace it, let's practice it, and share our activity with others. Or again, it might simply have been for commercial purposes. Now the fourth trajectory, this one here, where it was exclusive and remains exclusive. In fact, many of those activities and clubs no longer exist, often because they were exclusive because of race or religion or social class. Elite private clubs like sailing clubs or cricket clubs, skating clubs, those are the few examples we could find that remained exclusive over the generations. All the other forms of cultural physical cultural forms that we saw, that the diversity that we saw, if they were exclusive in the first generation, they either disappeared or simply became much more inclusive in subsequent generations. And this becomes really important to consider if we're going to talk about how to support using public funds these activities that are associated with ethnic communities. There's clearly a concern in public policy for supporting an ethnically exclusive event or activity. But the evidence tells us a number of things. First and foremost, healthy physical activity is good for us, and it's something we should support. And we know, as I've demonstrated as well, or as the research demonstrates rather, that even if an activity is exclusive, subsequently becomes much more inclusive with generations of participants. And frankly, if you support ethnically exclusive activities, that becomes added to the diversity, to the diverse repertoire of activities that we can all engage in, potentially. Having said that, though, I feel like there's always lots of caveats in research, isn't there? Having said that, there are examples where exclusive participation, where membership is being defined along racial or religious lines, are continuing. One could say that these are in fact parallel sport worlds, sport opportunities, where people are able to participate because they meet a specific racial criteria. In which case, at first glance, one might say, well, then there you go. There's the evidence of fragmentation, evidence of ghettoization. But I would say to you, well, actually, that depends on your interpretation of what exclusive is. I mentioned already that Chinese 9-man volleyball actually falls into the second trajectory of exclusive participation by the first generation and then inclusive participation by subsequent generations. Let me give you some background. This particular activity has been played in the US since the early 1930s, but has a longer history in China. And as the name suggests, the first generation of players were Chinese people. But since then, there has been a large number of players who identify as Korean, Filipino, Japanese, and so forth. So there is, in fact, interaction between different ethnic groups within Chinese 9-man volleyball. Hence our justification for why we placed it as evidence of the second trajectory. Nevertheless, this particular event is seen as racially exclusive because there are codified rules that state that at least 2/3 of the players on the court at all times must be 100% Chinese, and the remaining players are of Asian descent. Chinese 9-man volleyball has 9 players, as the name suggests. The women play 6s, but 2/3 of the players, both in the women's and the men's games, must be of 100% Chinese descent, and the remainder Asian, and they specify what counts as Asian. South Asian is not included in that definition. It's primarily East Asian and Southeast Asian, which are the people who count. Mixed race is included, but they are highly surveilled on the court to see, do you really have Asian in there somewhere? And if you don't sufficiently meet that criteria, people will be asked to no longer participate. So even the players themselves question whether it's racist to maintain these types of policies. Now, as interesting as it is, my intention in giving you this example is not to engage in that debate of whether or not this is racial exclusivity, whether it's racist, et cetera, et cetera. Rather, I want to illustrate that irrespective of whether you view it as being racist or racially exclusive, the research suggests that they are still not reproducing a ghettoizing effect. The participants in this particular tournament, which has around 1,000 plus players, they're officially known as the North American Chinese Invitational Volleyball Tournament, and I'll just call it NACIVT from this point forward. So the participants strongly identified with their Asian identities. They felt very comfortable with other Asian people. They felt protected and buffered from racism and stereotyping that they actually experienced in mainstream sports settings. They nurtured and called on the ethnic ties that they felt bound them together and also linked them to other communities. So they would seek out financial support for their team or for the tournament using those ethnic connections. Or they'd encourage the players to go to Chinatown to support the economy in Chinatown. This tournament, which happens every year, takes place in or very close to Chinatown. And so they would be encouraged to go to Chinatown to eat for lunch, etc. But significant for this presentation is that despite their strong sense of connection to their Asianness and to the Chinese community, the players were also immensely proud of their cities and their countries. I asked one player to recall his most memorable tournament, and he explained to me that the tournament that was held in his hometown was special because it was in his hometown, and everyone from his team was from the hometown, and it was great to represent and to win for his city. One player's goal for his team was to win for their hometown. There was camaraderie between teams who were from the same city. One player, Kyle, I'll call him, recalled playing against a Washington team and being completely distracted by the other Washington team players who were sitting on the sidelines, and they had filled empty water bottles with rocks, and they were using them as shakers to try to distract, Kyle's team while the game was going on. They were trying to support their fellow Washington team players. Symbols of the nation were common in the tournament. There's always American flags, always Canadian flags. They always sang both national anthems before the tournament. One longtime player said that, we're from Canada. We always say we're from Canada. We're from Canada, we're from Canada, he said repeatedly. Another player said, oh yeah, I definitely cheer for Team Canada. And one player explained to me, we bring our Canada flags, we put them in the hotel room, in Washington in this case. They're very proud of being Canadian. And the patriotism of the American players was also quite evident. When I attended the tournaments, you could hear them chanting, USA, USA. And even when I interviewed the Canadian athletes, they marveled at how much the American players would be chanting over and over, beating on drums, chanting, USA, USA. So while at first glance it might seem like a very exclusive, parallel, even fragmented world, their participation actually served as a site to express their attachments to their hometowns and to their countries. In addition to the loyalties that they consistently express, the fact is the NACVT does not exist in isolation. Many of the players belong to teams that were in mainstream sport. They were recruited from those teams. They participated in school teams, local volleyball clubs. Even the players were acted as coaches or referees for mainstream volleyball tournaments. The overlap between mainstream and the NACVT volleyball circle is so great that participants actually would see one another at the different events. They would recognize other players in the NICBT when they were playing, representing their universities or their colleges. I'll give you one beautiful example. Amber, she became involved in competitive volleyball as a result of playing in the NICBT. Before that, she didn't even know how to play volleyball. And as a result of her encounters with her teammates, they encouraged her to try club volleyball, so mainstream volleyball clubs. And they knew which teams to go to, who to contact, and so they were the ones who act as gatekeepers for her to then take her volleyball knowledge outside. She says, that's what really took off my volleyball career. And she has since played internationally. She's even gone to the Olympics. There's actually a number of players in the NICBT who have been Olympians, who've represented their countries, or even play professionally. This success isn't to say that, it's the NICBT is sort of like a farm system where then you graduate onto mainstream sport, because that just assumes that one is better than the other. In fact, many players, even when they're successful already in the mainstream sport system, that's when they might come to the NICBT to play as well. Or they continue playing in both worlds. So we shouldn't make the assumption that one is somehow better than the other. So the NICBT serves as an excellent example of the relationship between sport and multiculturalism, because they are protecting their cultural heritage. They are able to participate in a cultural activity precisely with diverse peoples because of this Multiculturalism Act, and it's precisely that participation that has fostered their sense of belonging. And it is a sense of belonging that ranges in scale from their city to, broadly to the nation. Now, the relationship between sport and multiculturalism is really not simple, because the fact is the roots of the NICBT is anti-Chinese sentiment. And it continues to attract players every year because many players encounter stereotyping and discrimination within the mainstream sports system. They could not find a place to belong in the mainstream sports system, and it's through their participation in what someone might call a racially exclusive volleyball system, circle, that they were actually able to cultivate their sense of belonging, one that was very multi-layered, granted, but nevertheless rooted in the nation. I'm going to provide you with one more example to further complicate this relationship. And I'm going to just share with you the exploratory study that I did on Muslim men about their sport experiences. Now, it was a very small study and it's qualitative in nature, so I'm not trying to speak for, we simply cannot make generalizations about all young men who identify as Muslim based on this study. I first want to say that they all had very positive feelings and positive experiences in sport. They were involved in a wide range of activities: cross-country, cricket, rugby, football, squash, volleyball, what else? Rugby, martial arts, hockey, and of course the most common ones were soccer and basketball. And the level of participation ranged from recreational all the way to much more structured and competitive extracurricular leagues. And a key finding in the study was that they really worked hard to balance their sport interests with their desire to follow their faith. And sometimes this was easy to do. It was facilitated by their physical education teachers or their coaches, supported by their parents, especially the need to observe the 5 daily prayers, or having the option to be able to limit their physical activity participation during Ramadan when they were fasting, not eating or drinking between sunrise and sunset. But they did face some conflicts with regards to issues that were not necessarily on the field. It was more off the field, but nevertheless norms within sport. And I'm going to share some quotes of their experiences, and rather than a pseudonym, I've actually used participant number, so just to let you know. So for one conflict that was raised is coarse language. 3 of the participants felt very uncomfortable with how swearing is normalized in sports settings. You'll be hearing F-bomb, F this, F that, participant number 2 said. And participant 6 said it had just become so prevalent that he really didn't like it. One participant even recalled players swearing at parents who were sitting in the stands. And such practices were positioned as oppositional to Muslim sport contexts where swearing, even though it occurred, was far less frequent, and a player who did swear was often pulled aside by the coach to say, you need to calm down. There were even some organizations and teams that are clubs that specifically have a rule saying there's no swearing. ISLAM, a ball hockey league that was established in 2008, has had a no swearing policy since its inception. Sexualized language, talking about sex, sexualizing of women, objectification of women, was particularly troubling for the men. The locker room, therefore, became a site of conflict. Participant number 8 said, quote, "We used to be talking about girls, it was dirty jokes." And he said this was against my religion. But he said he went along with it because he wanted to be part of the group. He happened to be the new kid at the school, and so he just did it to fit in. And he would rationalize it by telling himself, well, maybe it's not so bad because I'm not actually committing homicide. He said he would lie to himself to try to get through it. Participant number 9 recalled an incident when he was really uncomfortable with the kind of degrading and disrespectful talk that his teammates were engaging, and he said it was, quote, disgusting, but he nevertheless joined in. And he just sort of trailed off in the interview. He said, just because and then he couldn't say more. And this particular individual recalled an incident when one of his teammates was really harassing a girl, one of his friends. And participant number 9 couldn't intervene. And he was really haunted by that, by the fact that he couldn't say anything, even though he knew that that it was wrong, what his teammate was doing was wrong. So some participants kept silent or went along with it, and others used different strategies. One participant, for instance, just would leave the room, would leave the space as best as he could. He just simply felt uncomfortable, and so he would leave. But this has implications for when we talk about interaction. So participant number 1 was talking about his hockey team, and he said, quote, "They objectify women all the time. That's all they talk about," he said. And he didn't participate in this locker room talk. He described his experience in the locker room like this. All he does is say, "Hey, what's up? Okay, what are we going to do in the ice? Okay, good, all right." And then he goes and does it, comes back to the locker room, and then, "Okay, see you next time," and then leaves. He avoided socializing with the players. So even though he was playing on a diverse team, the experience certainly did not foster integration or inclusion. He remained silent and didn't speak up in those situations. He would just leave. And he couldn't say anything because he felt that he had to support these guys. He felt that he had to, because it was a team sport, he had to simply go along. He described it as not already have that disadvantage of being the new guy, of being smaller than them, and interestingly, of not being white. He simply just couldn't criticize. He didn't know how they would react. He didn't want to tick them off, he said. And so he chose to leave the locker room as quickly as possible. He continues to play, but this is one of the strategies that he uses. Other factors that posed a problem for the men in the study were alcohol consumption and the lack of halal food during post-game socials. And so some of them found it far more comfortable and easier to participate in Muslim-led or Islamic-informed sport. And within such a context, they knew that, many of the issues or challenges that they face would not be a problem. Assurances that halal food would be available, for instance, or that during Ramadan, games wouldn't be scheduled. With respect to the food and social engagement, socializing with the team, as an aside, when the participants of a particular activity shift, so too does how people celebrate shift. And that is yet another norm that has to be negotiated as well. We don't necessarily think of that if we're thinking specifically about, well, they come in the door and they get to play or they get to go on the field. But there are so many norms outside of sport that are still part of the experience. When a racialized or marginalized group self-segregates, when they choose to play with members of their own community, be it ethnic, religious, or otherwise. We shouldn't assume that it's simply their own preference. Oh, it's just what they do. They like to stick to their own kind. There may in fact be other issues, such as social exclusion or discrimination, that are at play. My intention in sharing this study about Muslim men, the 9 Muslim men that I studied, isn't to further emphasize difference. It isn't to further call attention to how different people are, but instead to focus our attention on cultural norms within the mainstream sport context that often go unquestioned or are often dismissed. We have to think of belonging as a two-way street. It's not just one side that needs to change, one side that needs to conform, just one side that needs to endure conflict, simply because they're new to the scene. Instead, the diversity of ideas, ways of being, ways of moving that multiculturalism is supposed to foster, supposed to offer us, can be an opportunity for us to scrutinize our own practices and our own norms and imagine how we can do the same thing differently. So does sport unite or divide us? My answer is that it does both. For even when it unites us, even when it divides us, be it in terms of skill level or access, the diversity of opportunity and participating with a diverse group of people offers at minimum a shared experience from which common ground could be fostered and community can be fostered. It does both because of how difference is understood. Some forms of difference are fine, provided everything else remains the same. Some difference is seen as simply incompatible. Whose norms are thus considered different? The question is not, therefore, whether sport divides or unites us, but rather what are the terms of belonging and who must change in order for belonging to occur. Yes, sport can unite us, and so long as belonging is a two-way street, it can unite us so long as the question of who or what will change doesn't inspire defensiveness, but initiates dialogue. Thank you.